Chapter 3, American Pageant. This is Mr. Shea for Notre Dame High School AP United States History class. Okay, we're going to focus on religion here for a little bit because religion is the main motivating factor for colonizing the New England colonies, as opposed to Virginia, where we know gold and eventually agriculture, especially tobacco and land, were motivating factors. In New England, it was very different. It started with religion. It started with the Protestant Reformation, and we moved from there. So, first, let's start out with what Puritans believed in. One, they believed in predestination. That means that God had a certain idea, or had an idea, knew exactly who was predestined as elect saints, visible saints, those individuals who would spend eternity once they passed on with Him in heaven, and those who were not elect and would spend eternity in hell. So these elect would discover whether or not they were so through conversion. And conversion was when God would reveal some sign to them that made them aware of their election, of their sainthood here on earth. And then typically they would have to have a trial, or at least answer questions, which would confirm or not confirm that conversion. Well, eventually, the Puritans, or at least the elect, demanded more. They demanded complete purification of the English church. And what do we mean by that? Well, they believed when they would go to church, sorry, I'm skipping ahead here a little bit. King Henry, although he broke with the Catholic Church, the crown still took the stance that all were members of the Church of England, whether they were elect or not elect. And many of the Puritans had a hard time with this. They wanted only the elect to be in their churches, to sit in their pews. Eventually there are a group of separatists. And these separatists are your extremists, your Puritan extremists who believe that only the elect should be a part of their church, and they want to separate from the Church of England completely. So many of these individuals end up moving to Holland, but after a decade or so, they want an opportunity to begin anew. They still want their children raised as English children, so they take the opportunity to go to the New World, to America. Now, they do this almost by accident as far as where they landed. They have to convince the Virginia Company to allow them to charter the Mayflower and to head out to establish their settlement. They aim for just north of the Virginia claim, or in the northern parts of Virginia, but end up in Plymouth. So they missed their mark by quite a bit. And when they realized this, they had to come up with their own plan of action, and that's where we have the Mayflower Compact. It's not a constitution. It's a simple agreement to establish a government by majority for these individuals who are disembarking. And remember that not all the individuals on the ship are Puritans. Many are not. Okay. This gives you a recreation of Plymouth. You can go see this and visit this even today. Okay, so now we move forward. The Puritans established Plymouth. They have a very difficult first winter. They lose 60% of the people, but nobody leaves in the following spring. They have a bountiful harvest. They do very well. So they're establishing themselves and creating a community that how they want to create it. We know they have the first Thanksgiving in 1621, and away they go. Moving forward, because Plymouth is very small, a larger group of non-separatists in England decide that they also want to purify the Church of England, but not from the outskirts, from within. They want to change things and how the church works from within. So they have a hard time, however. They're considered by many, especially leaders, as being revolutionaries, just not good for the Church of England. And so they decide also that they're going to establish their own colony in the New World. They receive a charter and head for Massachusetts, what's called the Great Migration, 1630. 70,000 refugees head for Massachusetts. Okay, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, we didn't mention Bradford for the Plymouth Colony, was elected governor over 30 times. And John Winthrop becomes governor in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's a much larger colony. Uh, the idea of establishing this colony is clearly to build on their religious beliefs, on their community beliefs. They do establish that government in their colony is created for the purpose of enforcing their religious rules, practices, yet they still hold to some separation of church and state, which we'll discuss in about 5 or 6 slides. Just gives you an idea of where some of the immigrants came from. It's tough to say immigrants, but where the migration in England stemmed from. Okay, on this map, one thing to remember is not all who left England ended up in North America, whether it be in the Chesapeake Bay region or even in New England. That many went to the West Indies, and that's where the sugar plantations were. It's not hard to figure out why. If you went to New England, you're going to rocky soil. There's still uh, Indians in the area. It's still dangerous, harsh winters. Chesapeake required a lot of work. You'd probably have to be an indentured servant. And if you went to the West Indies, the weather's better. There's opportunity for work, establish yourself. So you could see why many would go to the West Indies. Okay. So whenever we see franchise from now on, if you're disenfranchised or if you're franchised, that's talking about the right to vote. And initially, if you're talking about Plymouth, Plymouth would only have those who were elect would be able to vote. Later, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, anybody who was a member of a Puritan congregation and an adult male had the right or a say in that colony's rulemaking. If you didn't belong to the church, if you're an unchurched man as a slave, you did not have a vote. So here again, you see it's difficult to see a separation of church and state, um, but it did exist. Okay. Okay, was the Bay Colony a democracy? No, it was not. There was still a royal governor, especially later. So you start out with governors in place, and then later the governor becomes much more influential, and judges and other town officials are brought right from England, and so it becomes less and less independent. Okay, but even in the beginning, it wasn't a democracy. They're still under the rules of England, but they made their own laws on a local level because that was really traditionally what even English towns did in the motherland. Okay, so were the Puritans just individuals who just prayed and punished those evildoers? No. You didn't know if you were an elect, that's true, until the conversion, and all that stuff. However, they still tried to live a pious life, and just in case. So there were rules, against things such as, kissing in public or things like that. But they did sing and dance and have festivals within their community. So it wasn't just all stale and stagnant. There were taxes paid to the church, okay, and that was paid for church officials, okay, so that did happen. They did have a great work ethic. If you look at the typical Puritan town that was created during this time period, it's what we see here in Connecticut now. Most towns had a main street, several small houses, small self-subsistence farms, and usually they led to a center green, a community green, which we have today in all our towns. Generally, a church would be right on the center green. If you go to most towns in the state of Connecticut today or Massachusetts, you're going to find the town is set up that way. Okay. This is a statue of Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson is one of the first to challenge Puritan authority in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Others, like Roger Williams, also challenged Puritan authority, but she really challenged it in a different way. Not that she had to do work or that, but she was so educated and believed that she could carry out the Puritan doctrine, all of predestination, all the way out to its logical conclusion. And if that were the case, then she argued people didn't have to do anything who were elect. They could do anything they wanted to, and God would take them, because that's what the doctrine said. And of course, this is considered heresy. She goes on trial. She is on trial for a few days, where she actually does phenomenally well against local religious leaders. They see the danger in her speaking and her knowledge, and they realize that she has to go. So she is banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where she heads to Rhode Island, and then later, with her very large family, to New York, where all but one of them are killed by Native American raids. Roger Williams was an extreme separatist, so he's slightly different here. He believes that the Church of England is absolutely not the way to go, and he wants to completely separate. Now, remember, Massachusetts Bay Colony are not separatists; they're non-separatists. The original settlers at Plymouth were separatists. So he's constantly challenging the clergymen in the colony to break with the church, and he goes further to challenge the legality of their charter. And remember that the Massachusetts Bay Colony, their leaders took great pride in their charter. It gave them an astounding amount of independence within their community to govern and to establish the colony that they wanted to establish. So for him to challenge its legality created an enormous amount of resentment towards him. In 1635, he's also banished. They tried to banish him to England, but he's quick-witted. He ends up establishing Rhode Island, and we know that Rhode Island today, or Rhode Island then, was established as a very liberal colony, completely tolerant of all religion, which is very unique, very tolerant of Indians, which is very unique, and Roger Williams, for the most part, wouldn't even have necessarily wanted this type of colony, but it's just the only type of colony he could establish and grow quickly enough. What the colonists had most in common was they weren't wanted anywhere else. It receives the nickname the sewer of the New England colonies from leaders of the more established colonies. If you were in Rhode Island, any man could vote. So you had manhood suffrage. I already mentioned most of the information on this slide, so we'll move ahead. Okay, so let's go further out in New England, and we could talk about Connecticut. Connecticut starts really as two independent colonies, interestingly enough, Hartford and New Haven. And when we talk about these two, eventually they're merged. Okay, we're going to get to that in a little bit here. But eventually the two are merged. It just becomes Connecticut. But the fundamental orders, it's why on our license plates, the Constitution State is written on the top of each license plate. The fundamental orders are a framework, a track to run on for the modern day Constitution. It was used for the Connecticut State Constitution, and later many of its principles were used in the National Constitution. Eventually, Plymouth in 1677 is absorbed by Massachusetts because it becomes part of Massachusetts. We're going to mention that Maine also becomes a part of Massachusetts and won't be separated from Massachusetts until the Missouri Compromise in 1820. New Hampshire is also absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and eventually New Hampshire will become its own colony, but that's not until much later, or almost 4 decades. Just a map. You kind of see how things were spreading at this time. Okay, so initially the Native Americans and Puritan settlers got along relatively well, but as time moved on and New Englanders spread out, established more farms, and population grew, Native Americans realized that they're going to have to fight if they want to keep their land. One of the first of these fights was the Pequot War in 1637, which ended abruptly at the Mystic River with the execution, the burning of an entire Pequot village. And after that, Native Americans in Connecticut were rarely seen or had any chance of creating any type of problem for settlers. Later, King Philip, whose real name was Metacom, did unite several tribes in New England and successfully, for just over a year, raid New England, at least the outposts of New England farms, with very good success. Eventually, he's captured out of his tent. He is executed, quartered, and his head is set on a pike outside of Boston, where it was there for a couple of years. His wife and son were sold into slavery. 1643, the first sign of colonial unity with the New England Confederation. Its primary focus was on defense of the colonies, trade, what to do with criminals or taxes not being paid in one colony when those individuals would flee to the other colonies. Each colony had 2 votes, which the Massachusetts Bay Colony didn't like. Remember, in this alliance, though, Rhode Island is completely excluded from this arrangement. Okay, what allowed these colonies to act this way? What allowed them to operate on their own, even though they were still English citizens? And much of that was just what was going on in England. You had a civil war in England. You had a tradition, really, in England of this neglect. We're going to call it salutary neglect soon. We're going to get into that term. So during this period, the colonists really developed an independent state of mind. Although none of them would have said they wanted to create an independent nation. They were all very loyal to England. They just got into the habit of doing things their own way. Well, when King Charles II takes over in 1660, he resents the independent nature of the colonists. And he decides he's going to step in and become much more involved in their management. He's especially upset with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony becomes very elitist in its belief that it is the most important colony in the region, that it has the most power and is the most independent. And Charles II, to send the Massachusetts Bay Colony a message of who really controls these colonies, grants Connecticut a sea-to-sea charter legalizing squatter settlements, and later grants Rhode Island a new charter sanctioning religious tolerance. These are really irrelevant because Connecticut was already operating in Rhode Island also, but it was very relevant to the Massachusetts Bay Colony because they resented these other colonies and their establishments. And so for the English crown to come in and say, they're fine, we give them our blessing, so you have to as well, it was definitely a shot at the Massachusetts Bay Colony's leadership. And then later in 1684, the Bay Colony Charter was revoked by the London authorities. And remember that we talked about earlier, the Bay Colony cherished their charter. And for it to be revoked was enormously harmful to their psyche. We're talking about a lot of different kings here in the English dynasty, so you take a look at timeline of who's in power and when. Okay, so James II, when he comes into power, he also carries on Charles II's ideas of controlling these colonies with a more hands-on approach. And remember, again, these colonies have had decades of establishing life without tight English control. And so for these few years, it was very difficult, and they were almost in open rebellion. It was close. In 1686, the Royal Authority creates the Dominion of New England, headed by Sir Edmund Andros. And in this, Andros takes complete control and authority over the New England colonies. It's where we have the story of our charter oak tree here in Connecticut, where the charter was hidden in a gigantic oak tree, not letting Andros's soldiers take it into their possession, so they couldn't lose their charter. They didn't, I guess, they didn't digitize things, so you actually had to get your hands on it. One important restriction now placed, or not really restriction, but enforcement, the navigation laws. The navigation laws existed from the beginning, and they were really laws that were supposed to promote colonial trade primarily of their natural resources, agriculture, uh, shipbuilding, things like that, that they were building and producing in the New World. Primarily supposed to trade with England. That's how England made money. That's how it increased its economic prosperity. Colonists would trade specifically with them, with England, with English merchants, and then those merchants would sell the goods. Now, England in the South, the national government didn't take these goods. That's not how it worked. It was just a restriction on who they could trade with. But colonists over the years have begun to trade with countries, or at least merchants from countries around the world. And England had ignored it because it was prospering enough from the percentage that was traded with the motherland. Well, the navigation laws now are going to be strictly enforced, creating tighter control. And that creates the need for smuggling um, of goods by American colonists. So we have in America this tighter control all of a sudden under Andros, and what really changes everything and really contains maybe what would have happened. Maybe we would have saw an American Revolution earlier than we saw it. It's possible. What really contains it is the Glorious Revolution in England that overthrew James II and put in William II and Mary II. And as a result of the Glorious Revolution, once word gets to the New England colonies that, you know, the Catholic King James II has been overthrown. Well, Andros has no chance in New England, and the New England colonies go into really open rebellion against any of the soldiers that were there from Andros, and Andros himself is captured and exiled, trying to escape in women's clothing, and essentially things are back to the way they were before the Dominion of New England, although Massachusetts Bay still receives a royal charter and has become a royal colony now. So no longer a proprietor colony, it's now a royal colony. So that's slightly different, and now we're going to see the royal governor come in. We're going to see some judges, again, town workers, things like that in Boston who are appointed by the crown. So still different, and Massachusetts Bay colonists still resented what had happened, but it was certainly better than Dominion of New England. So from this period on, and under the new leadership, a period of salutary neglect, intentional neglect of the colonies by England, turning the cheek, not enforcing navigation laws specifically, allowing the colonists to continue with their local governments and assemblies and their local elections. That's going to continue now all the way up until post-French and Indian War in the middle 18th century, which will eventually, when the English decide that they're going to convert back to a stricter and more hands-on policy, they're going to be faced with absolute resistance, and that's what's going to lead to the Revolutionary War. It's just on a larger scale. That might be Andros trying to escape. Okay. Okay, so who else was involved in North America and exploration? Well, the Netherlands were involved. Their navy became very strong as a result of English support in their wars against Spain. Eventually, however, the Dutch turn on the English and fight against them in open conflict. The Dutch also expanded their commercial naval powers through companies. So the Dutch East India Company and then the Dutch West India Company both became very powerful trading companies, and what they did to protect themselves was they hired private soldiers, they created their own fleet, their own navy in order to protect their trade interests in the New World. They also sent their own explorers, and Henry Hudson, okay, we know goes into the Hudson River Valley and ends up claiming what we know today as modern day New York for the Dutch crown. They also buy Manhattan for, and again, it's such a loose term, buy Manhattan, because the Native Americans didn't really think they were selling it, but really just by trading some jewels and trinkets. Okay, so how does New Amsterdam, which New Amsterdam becomes a vibrant trading port in the New World, a great place for commerce in and out, and from there a staging point to the West Indies, back to Europe. It also becomes extremely diverse. We see the first, or we see the first synagogue established in the New World, or at least in North America, is in Manhattan. So you have a very diverse community, religiously tolerant. But over time, how does it become from New Amsterdam, or switch over from New Amsterdam to New York? And that really is just uh, the King of England gives the Duke of York this land and sends warships up the Hudson River, and without even a fight, New Amsterdam eventually surrenders. I think I'm jumping ahead here. Surrenders and becomes New York. Okay, and you guys can go through some of these slides in your reading. I did skip here slightly ahead, but the Dutch aren't there for long, so I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides. There we go. Okay, so let's move on. Some of the Dutch influences you could read in your book, things like sauerkraut, uh, the town of Brooklyn. I don't know. I forget a lot of their influences. Okay, let's move on. Apologize for that. I'm also getting my kids just made their way through the living room, so I'm a little distracted. Pennsylvania and William Penn and the Quakers. The Quakers are really unique. The Quakers are pacifists. They believe in being tolerant of all peoples, religions, Native Americans. They're looked at as dissenters. They refuse to swear oaths. They refuse to swear oaths because they believe that that's God didn't want them to swear any allegiance or anything like that. So they gave towns very difficult, or church government a hard times. They wouldn't swear oaths to anything, and local governments. So eventually, William Penn, because his father was owed a debt by the crown, is granted an enormous amount of land in North America. He sees it as an opportunity to create the perfect society for his people, and he does that. So Pennsylvania, a very vast land, very very wealth and agriculture, becomes a haven for Native Americans. Many Native Americans would actually migrate to Pennsylvania under William Penn's leadership. The problem with Pennsylvania is he's so tolerant of all people coming there that eventually many of the people who come there are not as tolerant Native Americans, and eventually that's going to lead to conflict. Okay, so what happens eventually? Well, Pennsylvania over these years, and Penn's experiment will grow to one of the most powerful, largest, wealthy colonies in the New World. Okay, a lot of repeating here. Okay, some other differences. The church is not supported by a tax. That was very different from what was going on, we already know, in Massachusetts. There were still blue laws. Blue laws became very popular in Connecticut because it was the color paper was written on. But blue laws are laws that we still see around here today. In Connecticut, you are not allowed to sell alcohol after a certain time, 9 o'clock at a liquor store, alcohol store. That's a remnant of a blue law. Okay, so Pennsylvania still had these prohibiting ungodly revelers, stage plays, playing cards, dice games. Right, too much laughing, too much partying going on. You're not allowed to do that. But it was definitely less stringent than the New England colonies. Okay, later on, New Jersey was started by sorry about that, guys. I just had to turn the microphone off for a second here. Okay, where were we? New Jersey. New Jersey, nothing significant of note for our quiz to discuss. Okay, except that you do have Quakers that move into this area and into Delaware as well. So their ideas are spreading, and really they're all offshoots of Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania's successes, it did attract really very good people to the area initially. It also had strong moral principles, anti-slavery from the beginning, immigration open to all from the beginning. Okay, good relations with Native Americans, very unusual. Uh, Economic opportunity for all. Philadelphia established a city of brotherly love. We're going to see Ben Franklin come to Philadelphia as a 17-year-old from Boston and really come alive in this city. We know that Philadelphia becomes the staging ground for the Declaration of Independence, for the first and second Continental Congresses. So when you sum up the middle colonies, the New England colonies were economically self-sufficient. They did have some trade, shipbuilding, fishing, small agriculture, but again, the soil is too rocky to establish large plantations, so it never really thrives in that light. But the communities themselves do very well. In the middle colonies, it's just a very interesting mix. It's not as small as New England, but not as big as the southern plantations. Slavery does exist in these colonies, but not nearly as much as in the southern colonies, and probably just a little bit more than New England. For the most part, the middle colonies are made up of smaller farmers, smaller communities, except in New York, where you do have an aristocratic class with large, expansive farms. Trade. So the middle colonies are really a great mix between trade and agriculture. Very diverse compared to the New England colonies and the southern colonies. Okay. Kind of just summed all these up in my last rant there. Okay, guys, I'm sorry this is a little bit choppy, but it's the weekend and there's a lot of people running around. So I did the best I could. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you guys on Tuesday.